No?
We're gonna run transects on this thing all day long, I think.
Center, yeah.
Yeah,
Well, then we'll call that 2.
Whatever's going to be the center transect, we'll find a number for it now, I guess. So archaeologists do archaeological survey in order to find traces of where there was human activity in the past. That includes settlements, where people lived on the landscape, as well as where they did other kinds of things. So sometimes they might be interested in finding where they did flint knapping, or where they got various raw material sources, where they did farming. So sometimes they're farm outbuildings, that kinds of thing. And it varies a lot by time period as well. But essentially we want to find out how people disposed themselves on the landscape in the past. But we also have to temper that with knowledge that where we find things on the modern landscape isn't exactly a direct reflection of where these things happened on the ancient landscapes. A systematic survey is important because it gives us kinds of information you can't get from standard archaeological excavations. Most people associate archaeology with excavations, and excavations are great and they accomplish a lot of things that we can't do with the archaeological survey. However, they're very focused on a small space and sometimes a small time, sometimes some time depth, but because you're only looking at a particular site in an excavation, you're only looking at a very small space and only the time periods that happen to be represented at that particular site. And it doesn't give you really the big picture. And certain kinds of processes that archaeologists are interested in involve things that happen over large territories, kind of thing. So archaeological survey is kind of ideal for finding out how different kinds of sites are related to each other. Even then it's not easy, because usually we only find a small, really quite tiny proportion of the artifacts that exist at these sites, from which we have to draw as much interpretation as possible. And they're not always going to give us the key evidence that we need for the connections between sites, but nonetheless we can sometimes find, for example, pottery that is found at one site, but we can figure out was actually made at some other site, which tells us something about trade relations between the sites and that sort of thing. That's the kind of evidence you're not likely to be able to find from looking at only one site. So it gives a survey a role that's a little bit different than the role of archaeological excavation. Well, there are a lot of different ways you can do an archaeological survey, and I think one of the reasons to think carefully about how we do archaeological survey is that you don't want to have distributions of archaeological sites or archaeological material culture that tell us more about how the survey was done than about how people disposed themselves on ancient landscapes. And I think there's a real danger that a lot of maps that archaeologists produce at the end of an archaeological survey really tell us more about how the survey was done. So you see gaps in survey, it looks like there are no sites here, and when in fact it's actually that either nobody surveyed there or the type of survey we did was not adequate to find the remains that are there. Or alternatively, it may be that that is a part of the map where we can't expect to find any archaeological remains because of geological processes that have either completely removed all the archaeological traces or buried them deeply under colluvium or alluvium or other kinds of deposits. So that it makes it very difficult for us to find them. And it would be pretty naive to assume that these gaps in the map mean that there were never any people who lived there. So I think we need to be more sophisticated about how we do archaeological survey, not only so we improve our likelihood of finding archaeological remains, but also so we understand better what the distributions of archaeological remains really means. Well, the Wadi Quseiba survey follows on previous surveys that I've done in a nearby valley called Wadi Ziglab. And when I initially did survey in Wadi Ziglab, it was a fairly conventional kind of survey, or at least today we would think of it as a conventional survey. At the time it was not quite so conventional, where one did a kind of a random spatial sample of the map. You know, you have randomly pick squares off a map and you go and you survey them and see what was there. And in several years of doing this kind of survey, I realized that this was not actually a very effective way of finding out how space was used in Wadi Ziglab, which is a fairly large valley in northern Jordan. And it became very obvious to me that certain parts of the map weren't likely to have any trace of archaeological sites that I was interested in, and in other parts of the map, it was much more likely that such sites would occur, but only if you looked for them very carefully and in certain ways. You couldn't just randomly wander around the landscape, nor was it useful to try to walk nice straight transects that went perfectly north-south when you're surveying in terrain that's very mountainous and has deeply incised valleys, and where a lot of geological processes have had a big impact on where things are. So it became clear to me as the years went by that the more sensible approach was to do a survey that took the geological factors into account and that targeted the areas where it was most likely that archaeological remains of the target periods would be both preserved and potentially visible at or near the modern surface. And that limits the areas where you can survey quite a bit in an area like Wadi or Wadi Quseiba, where we're now surveying, because these are deeply incised river valleys where erosional processes are really significant, and the valley floor today, or the Wadi channel where the water runs through, is in some cases significantly deeper down than it was, say, 10,000 years ago. So if you're looking for sites that are 8,000 or 10,000 years old, or let alone older, you have to take these kinds of processes into account. So that's kind of the base level difference, is that we try to take these kinds of geological factors into account. The other difference that we're experimenting with in the case of Wadi Quseiba survey is that we're trying to account for the variation that results from the fact that we as human beings, when we do a survey, are not perfect detectors of archaeological remains. A lot of surveys that have been done in the past have the implicit assumption that when an archaeologist walks across a piece of the landscape and surveys it and doesn't find anything, that means there's nothing there. When the reality is, as we all really recognize, that we are imperfect and we quite often will miss remains. And the question is, how do we assess that difference? So one of the things we're doing that's a little bit novel is to try to measure our effectiveness as surveyors and use that as a way to temper our results. So there's ways you can quantitatively kind of adjust our results, so that when we survey a particular chunk of space and don't find anything, instead of just saying there's nothing there, we can say that there's a certain probability that there's nothing there, but there's also still a certain probability that there is something there, we just missed it. And that's, I think, is something that's important and somewhat new. And we're trying to develop the methodologies to make it easier to do that kind of approach. The target materials that we're looking for on the Wadi Quseiba project are mainly sites belonging to the period from roughly 15,000 years ago to about 7,000 years ago. We certainly record other kinds of sites when we find them, but we're trying to predict in advance which parts of the landscape are more likely to preserve these kinds of sites, as well as of that set of landforms, the subset where we're most likely to be able to find them. Because in some cases, there'll be landscape portions that may well have sites belonging to these periods, but they're either too deeply buried or too heavily covered with vegetation for us to find them effectively just by walking across the land surface to look for artifacts. One of the reasons I'm focusing on those particular periods is that they're fairly underrepresented in most surveys in Jordan. Lots of surveys in Jordan have documented a lot of evidence for the Roman period and the Iron Age and the Bronze Age and so on, but the sort of late prehistoric period is fairly underrepresented in survey results. And I think it's to a large extent because the surveys haven't been designed to optimize the discovery of such sites. Many of them are only likely to be found in very restricted parts of the landscape, and in some cases they're pretty deeply buried by later deposits, which makes them very difficult to find. Well, the time periods we're targeting are also very important ones, and a lot of archaeological attention has been focused on these periods actually, because, for example, it's the time range within which we find the beginnings of agriculture, the beginnings of people living in villages and eventually towns, and the beginnings of more complex political organization. So there's a lot of interest in what was happening, particularly in the Neolithic, but also in the periods leading up to the Neolithic, what archaeologists call the Epipaleolithic. Follow the Neolithic are also fairly important ones, the Chalcolithic and the Early Bronze Age. Early Bronze Age is when you first get what some people will call state societies in this part of the world. It's questionable whether there were really state societies, at least in this part of the Near East, but at least they were politically more complex than some of the things that preceded them. So there's a lot of interest in both economic changes and social and political changes that happened during these periods. I think the regional scale information for some of these key time periods is actually quite poor. And as a result, you find in the literature statements being made about such things as site hierarchies, the assumption that big sites were controlling small sites and so on, without strong evidence. Because you really, to make those kinds of claims in a convincing way, you have to be able to show that there's some relationship between these sites. And I think a lot of the statements that have been made are really based on absence of evidence, because very thorough archaeological surveys have not been done in a lot of these regions, or there have been surveys that have been done that are only focused on later time periods. So we know lots about Roman or Byzantine or early Islamic site distributions, for example, but we might know very little about Neolithic or Epipaleolithic or Chalcolithic site distributions in the same regions. And I think it's very much premature to talk about the relationships among these sites when there are probably hundreds of sites that we're actually missing from our record currently because the proper surveys have not been done. I don't think you can draw conclusions about power relationships between sites when you're only looking at a small subset of sites that are spaced out hundreds of kilometers apart, when in reality it's quite likely that a more powerful site in some kind of regional hierarchy is going to be controlling small sites in its immediate vicinity, which have mostly not been found by archaeologists. So I think we really need to make an effort on a small region, which is what we tend to focus on in Wadi Zaklab and Wadi Quseiba, instead of trying to find one or two sites here and then excavate some other site 100 kilometers away. We're trying to find a lot of sites in a very small region and then do targeted excavations at a small subset of these sites to try to find out the relationships among these sites. And I think that's the way to go if we're going to learn about how these sites related to each other and what that can tell us about political relations and economic relations among the sites. It turns out that every valley in this part of Jordan seems to have a slightly different geological history. They do have some things in common. One of the things they have in common is they all drain into the Jordan Valley. And we know that the Jordan Valley is very tectonically active and it has been sinking. And the result of that is that the base level of drainage from these valleys keeps dropping, which causes the valleys to be more and more deeply incised. On average, the tendency is for these valleys to get deeper and deeper and deeper. So the valley floor that would have existed in the Paleolithic, in Paleolithic times would have been way up high relative to where it is today, which is why we find Paleolithic sites way up on these hilltops as well as in very high terraces on the sides of the valleys, which are basically stranded fragments of what was originally the valley floor. And then lower down, you find terraces that are fragments of the valley floor as it existed, say, in the Neolithic period. And then farther down still, you might find terraces that belong to Roman and Byzantine times or something like that. So you're not going to find in situ sites from early periods in the very bottoms of these valleys. So one of the things we focus on when we do the survey is to try to identify terraces that have some chance of being part of the valley floor as it existed, say, 10,000 or 15,000 years ago. So we come in with kind of a provisional idea of what might be target terraces. And in some cases, we're wrong. We come in there, we don't know for sure until we start to survey, and then we sometimes find out that ones we think probably date to around the Neolithic are actually, say, Byzantine period or something like that. So we know that we need to look higher up. In other cases, maybe we're too high, we need to look lower down. So part of the process is to learn how to date the terraces that exist. Once you date a few of them, it's very much easier to date the ones that are left because you know they have to connect together because they were once part of the valley floor. So you essentially have old valley floors that have been segmented by the erosional cut of the modern Wadi channel, as well as many ancient Wadi channels that have been there. The other side of that coin is to do these kinds of assessments where we actually evaluate the surveyors to find out how effective they are, so that when we survey and don't find something in a particular part of the region, we can assess whether that is likely due to a lack of sites of the target time periods in that region, or simply due to the fact that we haven't surveyed it thoroughly enough, or we've surveyed it in the wrong way, or whatever the case may be. So I think the two things go hand in hand. You really, it doesn't help to be trying hard to find sites if you're not also assessing how well you've searched for these sites. And I think you can use the information that results from such an assessment to, or even to estimate how many sites might be there that you haven't found. Yeah, well, one of the goals of this particular field season was to try to test out the idea of using a kind of new kind of predictive model that was, to a large extent, based on these kinds of geological models that we're talking about. So I should perhaps preface what I'm saying by describing a little bit about what a predictive model is when we talk about archaeological survey. Generally speaking, nowadays, a predictive model is based in what's called a GIS, or a Geographic Information System, which is done on a computer, where it's kind of a computer-based mapping system where you can have different sort of layers in a map that tell you different kinds of information, like the modern topography and perhaps the geology and a whole bunch of other things. But one of the things you can use a predictive model for, and it's actually quite common in archaeology, is just to map probabilities of finding certain kinds of archaeological remains over the map. And typically, the way that has been done is by first of all, mapping the locations of known archaeological sites, and then try to find out what kinds of characteristics they have in common with respect to things like distance to water, topography, slope, whether the slope faces north or west or whatever, that sort of thing. And then do some statistical analyses to use that to figure out, to basically classify the map into regions that have more or less likelihood of containing archaeological remains of that sort. In typical examples, those kinds of predictive models have not taken into account, at least not very explicitly, the geological processes that have altered the landscape since distant time, which is particularly important when you're dealing with time periods that are 5 or 10 or 15 or more thousand years ago. Maybe not so important if you're only dealing with sites for the last several hundred years, but even then, sometimes substantial changes can take place. So one of the differences in our approach is that we start out with a predictive model that uses the modern topography as a starting point, but then tries to identify in that modern topography landforms that have some chance, at least, of being fragments of ancient landscapes. So you try to find where on this ancient landscape sites would most likely have been, or what parts of the landscape would have been popular attractors for settlement, shall we say, in certain time periods. And then in addition, we have to factor in the chance that we could find them even if they're there. Because sometimes it could be a part of the landscape where there's highly likely to be a Neolithic site, but it's probably buried under 10 meters of modern colluvium or recent colluvium. So no matter how hard we survey, we're not going to find it. In which case, we probably shouldn't waste a whole lot of time surveying that part of the landscape. If we're lucky, we might find some eroded channel through it that exposes part of that site. Or maybe somebody bulldozed a road through the site, in which case we can find stuff. But if it's not been disturbed in any way and it's buried deeply under stuff, we're not likely to find anything there. So another aspect is, what is the probability of finding stuff given that it's there? And that one aspect of that is evaluating our survey effectiveness too. So another aspect is, what is the probability of finding stuff given that it's there? And that one aspect of that is evaluating our survey effectiveness too. So in different kinds of vegetation cover, for example, we're going to be more or less effective. So in plowed fields, we can be pretty effective at finding things, and the plowing churns up artifacts from a few centimeters below the surface as well, in some cases 10 or 20 centimeters below the surface. which helps archaeologists. On eroded slopes where stuff is being eroded out, that also improves our effectiveness. But on a flat agricultural field that has wheat standing a meter high, very densely, or worse yet, very densely growing with thistles and thorns, the odds are very low that we'll find anything in that field. So the visibility of the modern surface, let alone the ancient surface, is a major factor in our finding things. So the model partly takes those probabilities into account as well. So then what we essentially try to do is assign guesstimates of the probability that different parts of the landscape will both have archaeological material of interest and be potentially detectable, and then map those out and rank them not just in terms of probability, but actually in what's called the probability density, which is just the probability divided by the area of the space, with the idea that our survey effort can be more effectively expended in the areas where we have the highest probability density of finding something. So two areas might have equal chance of having an archaeological site in them, but in one case it's a very big area, so that even if we spend 3 days surveying it, we might not find it. Whereas the other one, because it's smaller, the same amount of effort spent surveying that is much more likely to find the site. So we're not expecting we're going to find all the sites, but given the limited resources we have, we need to try to find as many of these sites as possible, and that's one way we can allocate our resources in a more effective way. And we don't do it only on the basis of the probabilities, because you also have practical and logistical factors to take into account. You know, if you just use the sort of mathematical algorithm, it might turn out you're supposed to first survey over here, then you're supposed to survey 14 kilometers over there, and then 19 kilometers up here, and you'll waste a lot of time driving in between all these places. So what we do, we use that as kind of a rough indication of where to survey, but then we also survey spaces that are close by that have reasonable probabilities of having stuff, even though they're not perhaps as high as some other place that's farther away. Well, one of the innovations of our project is to try to calibrate the effectiveness of the surveyors themselves. We're not trying to single out individuals in this process, but each individual on the crew, on several occasions over the course of the survey, is expected to walk over a test ground, which we've already previously surveyed to make sure that there are no artifacts there. But what we do is essentially we use random numbers to decide XY coordinates for random placement of artifacts that we put there that look at least somewhat similar to the ones that we're surveying for. So we include some flint flakes, that sort of thing, on the one hand, and potsherds also. The potsherds we use are modern ones, but we've selected ones that have colors that are similar to some of the archaeological ones we're using, and of sizes that we could reasonably expect to encounter in a real archaeological survey. And we plant these in the kinds of environments that we expect to survey. So some are plowed fields or plowed olive orchards. Some are pastures. Some are places that have kind of mixtures of bare rock and pasture. Some have lots of thistles and that sort of thing. And what we do is we have each surveyor walk a transect down the middle of this area that we've seeded, following a route that's set out, and fills out on a form as he's surveying whether or not he thinks he sees an artifact so many meters to the left or right, and it's strictly timed, and there are equations that we can use to take this information to assess the effectiveness of the survey. And to put it in really simple terms, basically each surveyor finds a certain percentage of the artifacts that are there. And that information, in combination with how quickly they were surveying, can be used to establish what is called a sweep width, which is basically the sort of nominal width or swath within which we would expect the archaeologist to find all of the artifacts. Now, in fact, we don't ever expect the archaeologist to find all of the artifacts in any swath, but what sweep width does is kind of pretend, let's say it might be 40 centimeters wide, we're pretending that we're finding all of the artifacts within 40 centimeters, but in reality what it means is that we might be finding 80% of the artifacts within that 40 centimeters, but we're also finding some artifacts outside the 40 centimeters that kind of make up for the 20% that we're missing within the 40 centimeters. So it basically means that on average, we're finding as many artifacts as would be the case if we had a perfect survey 40 centimeters wide. And depending on what kind of ground we're surveying, whether it's a plowed field or a pasture or something like that, our sweep width might vary somewhere between 5 centimeters and 2.5 meters, something like that. And it turns out it varies quite a lot, and we're trying to take that information into account so that we can calculate what we call coverage, which is basically the percentage of the landform that we're surveying that we would say that we've kind of exhausted, that we basically, if there was something there, we would have found it. And if we found nothing at all, we can use probability theory to estimate what are the chances that there actually were artifacts on that landform that we just simply missed, given that we surveyed 10% of it.